Hello there! Today I bring you a review of the wonderful The Crimson Petal in the White by Michelle Faber. I finished this last night and it absolutely changed me. I am in love with this book. I'm going to do this video in sort of two different sections, so I'm going to talk about it in a general, non-spoilery, not giving too much away kind of way, and then I'm going to give a warning and go into sort of the symbolism and why I loved this book so much, and I'm going to discuss the end in that section. So if you don't want to know anything at all, then don't watch that bit, but I will warn you before I go into that bit. So firstly, this is a Victorian novel set in 1875 in London. We first meet a prostitute called Caroline, who then leads us to a prostitute called Sugar, and we sort of follow them for a little while. We then break away from them and meet William Rackham, who is a man who is in line to inherit quite a large sum of money and a large perfumery business, but he is at the moment sceptical about going into that business, and he is coming into hard times himself. He then decides to meet a prostitute, and this leads him to Sugar, whom he falls madly in love with, and decides that he is going to take the perfumery business in order to be able to afford Sugar for himself. He buys her for himself. He says that he doesn't want her seeing any other clients. He pays as much as she would make through seeing other people, but only he is allowed to see her. He then installs her in her own house, and he completely just owns her. He pays for her. Sugar is quite a feisty, strong woman, and she is, at first you don't think she's going to take him up on his offer. She's writing a novel. She's one of the most desired prostitutes of the time because she's famous for doing anything you want. She's only 19 years old and she's beautiful in a very unique way. People fall in love with her, but she's not what you would call pretty. And you think that she's not going to take him up on his offer, but she does. And I think in her mind, she sees it that she is going to be able to do what she wants and write her novel and things like this. It doesn't work out that way for her. Also, William Rackham, whom we follow, I would say we follow him more than we follow Sugar. I don't think this is a novel about Sugar at all. We follow him home and we learn that he has a wife, he has a daughter. His wife, Agnes, was my favourite character. She's locked up in a room, she's very hysterical, and people don't take her seriously. She's the mad woman in the attic, basically. There are a lot of references to Jane Eyre in this. At one point, Agnes even directly compares, he finds one of the servants reading it, and there's a lot of Jane Eyre in here with the comparison between Agnes and Sugar. We also follow a sort of alternative storyline. We follow Henry Rackham, William's brother. He is a religious man and a really good man, and he starts to have feelings for a fellow religious woman called Emmeline Fox, who is a long-term friend of his. And his decline is really interesting because he starts to unravel when he has these sexual desires. His very desire for her begins to drive him a bit crazy. He feels like he has sinned just in desiring her. I found their story a little less interesting, although Emmeline Fox was a very fascinating character, and she pops up again at the end in relation to Sugar in quite an interesting way. But I found their story not as enjoyable, but it's also very interesting contrast, and the fact not that women are dirtying Henry Rackham or that they are corrupting him, but that he is corrupting himself with his very desire for women. And it's not, the blame is never put on the woman, he completely blames himself, which is a really also fascinating standpoint. The thing that originally made me love this book was the narrator. Now, we meet him in the beginning. He's a very unique second-person style narrator. He sort of leads you through the novel in the beginning. I'd say for the first sort of 200 pages he's there, and it's very much he's addressing the reader directly, and he's almost making it like a tour through Victorian London. So you meet Caroline in the first place, who then bumps into Sugar, and when the two part, the narrator will say something like, oh, who shall we follow now? I think we should leave Caroline there and follow Sugar. And he very much draws you straight into the novel. However, as much as I enjoyed this, and I wouldn't have minded this throughout, he does stop that at about 200 pages. The narrator's still there, obviously, but he doesn't lead you through the novel in the same way, and I think possibly because it's such a big novel, if that had been going throughout, it would have gotten quite tedious. But the narrator rejoins us at the very end. and closes the novel with the same guiding out as he guided us in, and I think that is such a good technique. For me, what really came across in this were the feminist undertones. I thought they were done fantastically. It's definitely, to me, a feminist novel, I would say. With Agnes's illness, for example, it was all based around the idea of her womanhood, and, for example, one incident, she talks about bleeding. She doesn't know what a period is. No one ever told her what a period is. So for however many years of her life, I mean, she's 23, and although she reads a lot older, because obviously she's the crazy old lady, but she's only 23 years old, which I think it makes it all the more hard-hitting. But no one's ever told her what a period is. So when she gets her period for all these years, every month, she's been thinking that it's a sign that she is dying. I think that is so fantastically done, because already Michelle Faber built up this really wonderful world about women and the treatment of women by men, and to have a woman locked in the attic by her husband have an ailment that predominantly is formed in her mind by her periods, I think is just wonderfully effective. People who have not read this or don't want to know anything more, then bye-bye. I hope you pick this one up, because you should. And people who have already read this or don't mind being spoiled, let's continue. Also, what I thought really interesting in terms of the feminism was the attitude of prostitutes, especially Sugar, because Sugar is such a strong prostitute. And she's so independent. She's writing this novel, and her novel is actually about literally taking man's manliness away from them, their manhood, chopping it off, killing them in really dramatic ways, and literally taking control of them. It's almost looked at that being a prostitute is almost a way for the women to take back the power, the control that they have, because obviously working in a factory or working as a housemaid or something like that barely make anything. Whereas being a prostitute, their sort of earnings are done completely for them. It's completely in their control how much they earn, and they can earn a hell of a lot more than they would working for a man, which I think is a really interesting view on it. And it's constantly brought back to this idea of prostitutes are sort of very much taking control of their lives. And I think when William buys Sugar and stops her from prostituting, apart from with him, he very much is taking control of her, and he quite literally takes her out of her life. It's sort of a house away from everything she knows. It's not in the centre of London, and he literally just installs her in this house, and that's really when Sugar's decline begins, because she is just there waiting for him all day, every day. She stops writing her novel because she's just waiting for him. Then becomes quite obsessive with him and starts following him and his wife to try and really gather a picture of them. And it's interesting for me, the relationship that develops between Sugar and Agnes, where Agnes sees Sugar, because Sugar's watching the house a lot. Agnes sees Sugar watching, and at one point she waves to Sugar, and she begins to think, because obviously she's always been told that she's crazy. So I think there's a certain hypochondria about her, but also there's a certain point where she just assumes that everything she sees is some sort of hallucination. So she assumes that Sugar is a hallucination, but she literally calls Sugar her guardian angel. She thinks that Sugar is this magical other being watching over her life, and obviously that's really not true. But it's a strange sort of relationship that develops between the two of them, because while Rackham's attention is on Sugar, he almost leaves Agnes alone to sort of come into herself, and she's still absolutely crazy and she's not well, but she starts to come out of herself a lot more than she was obviously when she was just locked away, because William's attention is elsewhere. After Sugar has been living in this house for a while and shadowing William for a while, it turns out that Sophie, his daughter, needs a new governess. So Sugar puts herself forward for the role. By that point, she's completely forgotten about her novel. When she's moving out of her house, she doesn't even give it a second glance. In fact, at one point, she starts burning pages from it because she doesn't need it anymore. She quite literally volunteers herself to become his servant, to serve under him. I don't think she ever loves him, but she becomes obviously obsessed with him because he's all she's got to think about. There's also a point where Sugar finds Agnes's diary, and that's when we really get to learn about Agnes's life. Also, when Sugar is teaching Sophie, she's flicking back to her own childhood. Her mother was a madam, a mistress of a brothel. So Sugar lived a very messed up and twisted childhood. We see the direct contrast between the two women, and I think the thing that really comes out for me is the fact that Sugar knows too much and has always been taught too much about womanly wiles, how to get above men, how to use your body, sort of thing, whereas Agnes does not know enough, and both of them being at such opposite ends of the spectrum but ultimately going down the same path. It was never quite clear to me whether Sugar genuinely had this desire to save Agnes, because obviously she quite literally becomes Agnes's guardian angel, but there's a point in here where she sends Agnes away and it's not sure whether she is trying to rid Agnes from the house to save Agnes, or whether she's also sending her away in order to insert herself in Agnes's place. And there's a scene just after Agnes has left and been presumed dead that William, Sophie and Sugar all go to have a family portrait, and Sugar's really smug about this because she's almost in the place of Agnes, quite literally. And William even asks her if she would fit into one of Agnes's dresses. And she doesn't realise that actually the reason that William is doing that is because now that Agnes is gone, Sugar has completely fallen in his desire and is only getting the pictures taken to chop out Sugar's head and put Agnes's on her body. Which I think is, again, such a strong point in so many ways about William's taking over of Sugar. Also, what was really interesting to me is that Agnes is presumed dead, so a body is found in the river, and so William goes to recognise it, and he doesn't recognise anything apart from when he gets to the bottom and he looks at her vagina and he recognises her from her vagina, which again I think is it goes so well with the themes of men and women and the strange control that sex has, and the fact that a man is only interested in a woman for what she has down below. And after William really starts going off Sugar, they don't have sex. He can't get himself aroused anymore for her. He goes out with his friends and ends up on the streets of London once more, and he thinks that he can no longer be aroused. He thinks he's broken in some way because his manhood is broken, and he finds himself aroused by a prostitute who is pleasuring his friend, and she puts her hand up and sort of grabs his hand to stop him from touching her head, and he even says about the power that he sees in her then, and he's suddenly aroused. So it's just that was the perfect bit for me, because he spends the whole novel taking these women and putting them under his wing and weakening them and taking their control away from them, and yet once they're weak he doesn't want them anymore. Sugar fallen in his favour, and she starts to realise this and really starts to panic and scrabble and try so hard to please him, but he still doesn't take it. So she takes his daughter and she leaves, and I think this story is quite notorious for having an open ending, but I thought the ending was just fantastic, because the last time we see Sugar, she is on a carriage with Sophie, which I think is such a good ending, because Sophie obviously was the next in line to fall under Rackham's wrath almost. Sugar quite literally saves her from the fate that Sugar herself met, and I thought that was very apt. And then William Rackham's power completely falls when he is running around the streets looking for Sugar. He goes to all her old brothels, and in one of them he actually runs up the stairs to try and discover her upstairs, and he falls through the step and injures himself and is then carried into the street by a prostitute. So quite literally the women are taking back the control, and there's a really nice bit there where he sort of wants her to stay with him and he's enjoying the process of leaning on her, but she leaves before she gets too tied up with him and before things get messy, and I thought that was just absolutely 100% perfect. So good. So good. Bye bye.